Hi, listeners. I'm Colleen Dieter, landscape consultant and certified arborist at ATXGardens.com. Welcome to the ATX Gardens podcast, where every other week I share simple, timely tips for what to do in your Central Texas garden right now. If you're watching on YouTube, tap like and subscribe for more gardening help. Hey there, gardening friends. Today we're talking about what to do in the second half of February, and I think it's maybe the busiest time for gardeners. It's the kickoff to our early spring season, so strap in because we have a lot to talk about this episode. And of course, today this episode is sponsored by my landscape consulting business, ATXGardens.com. Let's jump in. On the last episode, I talked about the ice storm and the extreme cold that we had. It got into the teens in most parts of Central Texas, down to 16. The good news is it seems like the storm was not quite as damaging as I expected. My prickly pear cacti came out okay. And a couple of listeners got in touch with me and told me that they had rosemary plants that survived that were covered. Another friend of mine told me that his rosemary died. He did not cover it, and it was really big and old, so I think it may have been on its way out anyway. I did see some dead citrus trees around town, but also some that maybe are just going to lose their leaves and the stems are okay. Same thing with olives. I saw some olive trees around town that were totally fine and others that were severely damaged. So, it's just going to vary a lot from plant to plant, species to species, and spot to spot because, we have little microclimates in our yards, and sometimes there's spots that are colder and some that are more exposed and then some that stay warmer. So, I really recommend that you make a garden journal or take some photos or videos or something to capture the information that you need going forward for next year when we'll probably get cold like that again. It seems like that's the new normal for us to get severe cold every year. And it's valuable to learn from those experiences and make some kind of record so you can remember what worked and what didn't. Did you cover something and the cover didn't work? Maybe it wasn't a big enough cover or a thick enough cover. Or, just make some notes about what survived and what didn't. I made a list of plants that are truly evergreen versus the ones that sometimes I think of as being evergreen, but, the tops died in this cold event because it got cold enough. So think about, making some records somehow, keeping track of that so you can learn from it. Now we're going to get into the category of woody plants. And it's still a good time for tree and shrub planting as long as they're native or well-adapted trees. You should wait to plant Mediterranean trees like figs or tropical shrubs like bougainvilleas. Wait until mid-March for those, but otherwise you can plant oaks, redbuds, hollies, things like that at this time of year. Do not prune your oaks right now because it's oak wilt season. Oak wilt season kicks off in February. So, especially with the warm weather that's in the forecast, pruning now can spread oak wilt disease. So, try to avoid it and wait until summer if you can for the oak tree pruning. It's still okay, though, to prune small ornamental trees like redbuds, hollies, crepe myrtles. Anacacia orchid trees, all the buckeyes. Just trim them to clear roof lines if they're rubbing on walls or growing into walkways, or if you need to trim branches out of the street or out of your driveway, if you keep hitting them with a car over and over again, then it's a good time for that sort of trimming. You can also trim those trees to shape at this time of year too, if you want to reduce their size or take off any sort of wild hairs that might be coming out from the center of the plant. It's a good time for that. Maybe in the next episode, I'll talk a little bit more about crepe myrtle pruning. So, for the rest of February, you still have time to continue pruning your roses as I described in the last episode. So, if you need tips about how to prune your roses, go back and listen to the last episode. Try to get your rose pruning done by March 1st before they start actively growing. I'm still working on mine and I'll be doing it till the end of the month. So I have a lot of roses. You still have plenty of time for pruning your fruit trees, though. In fact, some orchardists prefer to prune apples, pears, peaches, and plums while they're blooming. So that way, the orchardist can see how many flowers there are on each tree, and then they can control the amount of fruit that they get from each tree by removing flowers. So remember that each flower can become a fruit, and most domestic fruit trees make too much fruit, and that fruit needs to be thinned later in the season. And so some orchardists prefer just to remove flowers through pruning so they don't have to do as much thinning later. But you'll probably still need to do some thinning if you get a good crop of fruit. And later this spring, as the fruit's developing, I will definitely talk about thinning in future episodes. The deadline for pruning fruit trees is when they start growing leaves. Then you need to stop and you should not do any pruning in the spring when the new leaves are growing out. There's another opportunity for fruit tree pruning mid-summer, and some folks with older fruit trees prefer to do pruning in the summer rather than the winter because it slows the trees down where they won't grow as fast and you can control their size more easily to keep them shorter if you prune them in the summer. So, of course, in the summer, I'll cover that again and we'll go through summer fruit tree pruning, and also other types of trees too can be pruned again in the summer. So if you missed it, you'll get another chance in the summertime. Same thing with the roses too. If you missed rose pruning this February, you'll get another chance to do it in the summer, but you don't want to do it when there's new leaves growing. Now, you can still, in the last half of February, collect fruit tree scions, also known as cuttings, and you can store them for rooting or grafting later. It's also time for grapevine pruning. So if you have grapes, it's grape time for the grapes, and you can also collect grape scions as well and store them for rooting or grafting later. The second half of February is a really good time for planting most of your fruit and nut trees. You really want to get that done soon. You can do it in March, but you're really pushing it. It's really better to get it done by March 1st. Same thing with the shade trees and ornamental trees too. It's really optimal to get them planted in February, but if you can push it into March, but March is really getting hard for them to get established before it gets hot outside. And they also start growing their new leaves that are really tender. And when you're moving the plants around, moving those trees around, you're really likely to damage those new little tiny leaves, and that's really hard on the trees. So, if you're thinking about doing any tree planting besides the Mediterranean or tropical types, go ahead and get going on it and try to get it done in February. Shortly after pruning, you should feed your roses and your fruit trees according to your soil test results. You can't go wrong with a nice layer of wood chip mulch around the root zone out to the drip line. That will help all of your woody plants. Now, I'm going to talk about something on this episode that I haven't talked about yet on this podcast, and that is the deciduous shrubs. And the word deciduous means that they lose their leaves in the winter. And some of the more common deciduous shrubs around town include beautyberry, white, fragrant mist flower, rose of Sharon, also known as Althea, bee brush, almond verbena, flame acanthus. Those are all shrubs that you can trim now if you need to. You don't have to trim them. But if you want to change their shape or control their size, now is a good time to do it. So, for example, I have a customer who has white mist flowers very close to a walkway. And we like them to grow into the walkway just a little bit to kind of soften the edges of that garden. And you can kind of interact with the plants that way as you're walking by. And every winter, we cut them down to about 18 inches. So we leave about 18 inches of stem sticking out of the ground. And we cut off everything else to control its size, because if we left those stems, the plants would grow really 2 or 3 times bigger than they did last year. So we don't want them to get that big where they're going to take over the walkway or start growing over their neighboring plants. So we'll control them that way. I know of another situation where we have beauty berries, and, maybe once every 3 to 5 years, we'll cut the top half off of the beauty berries to control their height, because they're in a spot where we don't want them to get so tall, like in front of windows, where we don't want them to block the window. But, beauty berries, they don't grow very fast. So really just once every few years, we'll just cut the whole top half of the plant off. I have almond verbenas at my house, and they really get huge every year. And I just don't want them to get bigger than they are. So I cut them down every winter to about 12 inches. I leave about 9 to 12 inches of stem sticking up out of the ground. And I take away everything else, and they grow back every year. So these plants are very flexible. You can trim them kind of however you want. If you want to keep them smaller, you can cut them way back at this time of year to keep them small. If you want to let them grow bigger, that's totally up to you, totally optional. You certainly can. There are exceptions. This is a complicated group of plants. You'll want to avoid pruning hydrangeas, azaleas, spireas, and mock orange now, because you'll remove the flowers. They develop flower buds in the fall, and they hold on to those buds all winter. And then in early spring, when the weather starts to warm up, that's when those flowers open and bloom. So if you trim them now, you'll be removing flowers. So it's better to prune them after they're done blooming. Okay, so right after they're done blooming, that's the best time to trim them, and you would just trim them to shape. Again, if they have wild hairs sticking out, like wacky branches, or if you want to control their size and make them smaller, that's the time to do it, is after they bloom. Another interesting example is winter honeysuckle, the loniceras. And there's couple different kinds of loniceras that grow here, and they're blooming now. They bloom in the winter. Mine in my yard is still blooming. As soon as it's done blooming, I'm going to get in there and I'm going to trim it. And they always have like wacky wild hairs on them that I'll take off. And sometimes they get really huge and I'll really want to reduce their height. If you do it right after they bloom, that's the best time. And you could cut the top third off to reduce their height if you want to. So keep that in mind. It's time for deciduous shrub pruning. It's also a good time for trimming evergreen shrubs like hollies and cherry laurels, and I'll explain more about them in the next episode. And now we're going to have a message from our sponsor. Hi, y'all. This is Colleen from ATXGardens.com. If you want personalized help with your landscape, book a consultation and we'll walk your yard together, answer your questions, and create a plan that feels doable. This week, I helped some customers who built a brand new home out in the country outside of town. They had some beautiful post oak trees that were older and aging out. I gave them some advice about how to care for those trees. And they have a blank slate because they built a new home and they just weren't sure where to start with their yard and their whole property. And so, I just helped them get oriented and helped give them ideas of what was possible and give them the confidence that they need to move forward with their projects and start checking things off of their wish list. So check out atxgardens.com and book an appointment with me. So let's get back to the episode. Now we're going to talk about perennials and bulbs. Again, I talked about this in the last episode. Now that we've finally had a very hard freeze, it makes it a lot easier and more obvious that it's time to cut back all the perennials. So February is a good time to do it. I personally like to have it done before March 1st because that's when a lot of plants start to grow back again for the spring. March 1st is the last average freeze in Austin, so we're usually okay. Outside of town, it's more like March 15th. So you may want to wait a little bit because when the perennials start growing back from the ground, that dead material at the top can sometimes help protect that new growth at the base from cold weather. It depends on your risk tolerance. If you cut the tops off now and we still get a couple more hard freezes and that new growth gets killed at the bottom, the plants may not be able to grow back again later in the spring, and it could kill them because they run out of carbohydrates in their roots that they have stored in their roots so that they can grow back. So just keep that in mind. I think we're really getting close, though, to where it's pretty unlikely that we're going to have so much freezing weather that it's going to kill them. And I really like to have it done before March 1st because I think it's too complicated to cut them back when they really start growing a lot after March 1st. The new growth gets in the way of where you're trying to trim, and it just makes it more complicated. Then in the last episode, I mentioned the tops of bulbs getting damaged by the cold, like my Dutch irises. So I was really surprised. My Dutch irises came through the freeze better than I expected, and they're still standing upright. I really expected the leaves to be completely frozen and just turn into mush and fall over, but they just have just a little bit of cold damage on them, where the leaves look a little bit yellow, but they're still doing okay, and I think they might still bloom this year. Other more tropical types of bulbs, like our Texas ditch lilies, agapanthus, crinums, and hippeastrums, which are also known as amaryllis, they didn't fare as well. All the leaves turned into goo, and it's important to cut off the dead leaves, but just don't cut too low into the neck of the bulb where the leaves all come together at the base. So you kind of have like a big round bulb, and then there's like a kind of a stem that comes up off of the bulb, and the leaves come off of that. Don't cut into that stem. Just remove the dead leaves and keep that stem that's on top of the bulb intact, because that's where the new leaves will grow back from later in the spring when it really warms up. Okay, the last half of February is a really good time to cut down herbaceous evergreen plants. So those are things like cast irons, monkey grasses, also known as liriopes or liriope or lorope, sedges, and Asian jasmine and holly ferns. So these are all plants that stay green year round, usually, but they're not woody. If they have any cold damage or they look sort of ratty, you can cut them all the way down. I like to leave about an inch of stem or inch of little parts of the leaves sticking up out of the ground. So that way I'll remember that they're there and they'll grow back in March. If they look good, you don't have to do anything. You can leave them alone. If there's just a few dead leaves here or there on them, you can just trim off just those dead leaves if you want to. But it can get kind of tedious if there's a lot of dead leaves. You can just cut down that whole group of plants. You can even mow them with the lawnmower and they'll grow back again. The second half of February is also a really great time to trim your Salvia gregis, Damianitas, pink and purple skullcaps, Blackfoot daisies, Powys Castle artemisia. These are all plants that tend to be evergreen, but they're small and they're sold as perennials at the nursery. So because they're small and they bloom, they're in the perennial category, and they are perennial because they live for more than 1 year. They live for many years, but they don't go through the normal life cycle that other perennials do, where the whole top of the plant dies in the winter. They stay green year round. And so it can be a little confusing to know when to trim them, and now is a really good time for trimming them. I like to remove dead branches. I'll remove any branches that are growing along the ground horizontally. And then I like to remove the dead flower stems from the top just to clean them up a little bit. That sort of pruning helps motivate them to get new growth from the center, because a lot of those plants start to get kind of woody in the middle, they start to get really ugly. They don't have leaves in the center. There's just branches that look sort of dead and then green leaves out at the very end. So this sort of trimming motivates them to stay bushier. If you need help with that trimming, because it is kind of complicated, if you need help with that, that's exactly the kind of thing that I can help you with during a consultation. We can do that trimming together. If you're unsure how to do it, I can prune alongside you and show you how to do it. Now, moving on to the vegetable garden. Now, we're kind of in transition time for vegetables and herbs from cool season into the warm season here in the second half of February. So it's a busy time. It's time to assess all of the damage that you might have had in the vegetable garden from the cold and decide how to proceed. Like I said in the last episode too, you might just remove damaged plants and then prepare your beds for your warm season crops that you'll be putting in March. So you would just pull out those old plants, add some compost, add some fertilizer according to your soil test results, put down some mulch. I like to use leaves, shredded paper, pine needles, even your ornamental grasses, the tops of your ornamental grasses that you might be trimming at this time of year, you can use as a mulch in your vegetable garden. So you can get those beds all ready and just let them sit for a couple weeks until you're ready to plant the warm season crops in March. But if you still want to go with more cool season crops, it's your last chance to plant cool season crops in the vegetable garden. So that's stuff like collards, kale, mustard, lettuce, carrots, turnips, radishes, and beets. All of those can be planted from seed. It's a little too late now for cool season crops from transplants. So plants like cabbages, broccoli, and cauliflower, where we usually have to buy little plants or grow them from seed indoors much earlier in the winter and then plant them into the garden as little plants. It's getting to be too late for them now to really develop before it gets too hot and they get eaten by bugs when it starts getting too hot for them. So if you have those plants on hand now, get them in the ground as soon as possible, but don't get any more, don't buy any more. This time in February is your last chance for potato planting. So if you want to do potatoes, get them in the ground right away. You should be thinning your indoor seedlings of your warm season crops like tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers that you might be starting indoors. So if you started tomatoes, eggplants, peppers earlier in the winter, like back in January, um, you need to start thinning those plants if you haven't already, and it's important to have just one plant per pot. And so if you planted multiple seeds in your little pots and all of your little seeds came up, you need to remove the additional plants so you just have one plant per pot. It's important for the health of the plants for them to have enough space around them and enough airflow and light. So you can use snips or scissors to remove unwanted plants from your pots. Or you can, if they're still really small, you can do what gardeners call it pricking out, where you use like a long, like a bamboo skewer or some kind of long toothpick type tool. And you can pull out tiny little seedlings and then replant them to be by themselves. I have never had the patience for that. I just thin them and cut them down. If they're bigger, if they're getting bigger and they're maybe like, oh, getting to be like more than 6 inches tall, that's where they're starting to get big enough where you may be able to divide them, where you can actually take them out of the pot and kind of pull the plants apart real gently and sort of shake them apart a little bit, and then you can replant them into separate pots if you get enough of the root ball for each one. You can replant them into their own little pots, and then in a couple of weeks, you can move them into the garden, getting into late March and April. Then around March 1st, I also recommend starting to move those plants outside to an area with morning sun and afternoon shade on warm days so you can start the process of hardening off. And hardening off is one of those funny gardener terms that when you first start gardening, it doesn't really make any sense. But when you have been gardening for a while, you start to get the idea of what hardening off is. And it's where the plants kind of transition from being really soft and lush and tender and very vulnerable to the elements, being very vulnerable to weather fluctuation and vulnerable to bugs and stuff like that. And they go through this change where they become tougher. They start to become more stout. They start to branch more. They become more bushy. Their leaves will become maybe thicker, hairier. Sometimes they become more waxy. And that's the plant sort of beefing up its own defenses. So that way it's getting used to being outdoors in the weather and exposed to bugs. And that's the process of hardening them off. So you can keep them in their little pots and their trays and start putting them outside so they start getting used to being outside. And then if there's going to be really cold weather, you can bring them back indoors, to protect them and move them in and out as the weather changes, but it starts getting them used to being outside. And then, around March 15th, you can start putting them in the ground. So in the herb garden needs a little bit of reassessment at this time of year. It's time to go in and remove anything that died after the freeze. I think I've got some oregano that died, but some other oregano that survived, so I'm going to go out there and start cleaning up. Make notes about what you'll want to replace in the spring. It's the last chance for planting cool season annual herbs from seeds. So things like dill, calendulas, fennel, parsley, and cilantro from seed. Going into the spring, you can plant those guys from little plants. But now, if you're going to do seeds, you want to get the seeds in soon. If you want to, you could start some annual warm season flowers indoors if you like. So things like marigolds, cosmos, sunflowers, zinnias. You could start indoors if you wanted to get an early jump on them and get some bigger plants into the garden earlier in the season, though they're all very easy to start from seed directly outdoors when the soil warms up in late March. And of course, I'll touch on that again in future episodes. Now, for lawn care at this time of year, get your mower serviced and sharpen the blade to get it ready for the first mowing, which usually happens in mid to late March. You'll be seeing winter weeds coming in now, and you'll want to get out there and mow. If your winter weeds are starting to get really tall, you can go ahead and just mow them. If they're starting to bloom, you might want to mow with the bag on, so that way you're not spreading the seeds around of your winter weeds. So look out for those. In past episodes, I've mentioned the weeding tools. I really like a Dutch hoe, the Fiskars uproot weeder. I really like my Japanese handy weeder. So I'll put links to all of those tools in the show notes to help you with the winter weeds. And that wraps up today's episode. So check the show notes for links to everything I mentioned. And if you enjoyed my podcast, please share it with your fellow Central Texas gardeners. It really helps me grow the show. I'm Colleen Dieter with ATXGardens.com, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Thanks for listening to the ATX Gardens podcast. For show notes, tools, and to book a consultation with me, visit ATXGardens.com. Happy gardening! See you next time.